Welcome back. Let's bring in Samson Itodo. He's the Executive Director of Yiaga Africa. He joins us from Zambia. Mr. Itodo, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thanks very much for having me, and good morning.
Thank you for always coming through. Let's talk about the new development. You've been watching this space like forever. INEC says over 150,000 associations trying to become political parties, and now 14 have scaled the first stage, if you will, and will proceed to the next. Give us your first impression of of this whole development.
Oh, thanks, and good morning once again. The fact that only 8% of the 171 political associations that sought to be recognized and registered as political parties scaled through the first phase of the party registration processes actually calls for a great cause of concern. I think it's important that the public knows that there are criteria for registration that are established in law. The Constitution clearly outlines several conditions that must be met, and there are about 4 of them if you look at Section 222 of the Constitution. 1, you need a name, the addresses of the national officers. The Constitution has to be registered with INEC. The name of the association, the logo, and the symbol must not contain ethnic, religious connotation, and its activities, must not be confined to a geographical part of Nigeria. In other words, it must have a national appeal, and then they must have a headquarters, and that headquarters must be in Abuja. Now, it is Yiaga Africa's considered position that INEC's decision to invalidate the registration of those political associations is grounded in law. It sought to uphold, some of the principles and the requirements for registering in political parties. Because if you check some of the names, Geoffrey, you would see when INEC published some of those names, you see names like Village Intelligence Party, Zonal Rescue Movement, in fact, polling unit ambassadors. In fact, one particular association, a multipurpose cooperative association. And so you ask yourself, did these political associations look at provisions of the Constitution, of the Electoral Act, and INEC's guidelines before they applied? So there are several problems with some of the acronyms, the logos, and also the absence in some of the names of the parties. But you know what? INEC has a right, to enforce the law, but it must also ensure that its processes are transparent, they are consistent, and free from arbitrariness. And it's very clear so far, INEC has complied with its own regulations. And whilst these groups may feel disappointed, but INEC's action does reflect adherence to sort of established standards rather than arbitrary decision making. But again, the Commission owes it to those parties to disclose to them the reason why their application was denied, because that is what INEC's guidelines clearly say. And I think there are lessons that needs to be learned, that the onus is really on political associations to thoroughly understand and meet those requirements, because ignorance of relevant provisions cannot serve as grounds for exemption from compliance.
Well, Mr. Itodo, so 14 out of 171 applications, but it's not a done deal just yet for these 14 associations who have past the first stage of this process. There's also the fact that they have to go through a physical verification and then, of course, compliance with the legal framework. So if 14 made it out of 171, I'm just wondering if you think that these 14 will even make it to becoming political parties.
I think, let's be clear, there are about 4 stages of party registration based on, if you look at the combined effect of the Constitution, of the Electoral Act, and INEC's guidelines. The first phase is the application process. That application process, don't forget, the law is very clear that if you seek to be registered as a political party, you must submit your application 12 months before a general election. And the guidelines are clear that after you need to submit a letter of intent And that letter of intent must contain your name, your proposed name, your logo, and the acronym. And then afterwards, INEC will issue to that particular political association what is called provisional approval of availability and suitability of name. It's just the same process that is applied when you're registering companies with the Companies and Allied under the Companies and Allied Matters Act. That's with Corporate Affairs Commission. You've got 30 days to now do what? Pay certain fees and then submit the following documents. One, your constitution, your manifesto, your title deed, because the constitution says you must have a registered office in the FCT. And the evidence to establish that is either the title deed of that office or the tenancy agreement, and then the register of members. Those are the documents that must be submitted. So these 14, based on prima facie examination and evaluation, they have met this condition. So that's the first stage. The second stage is the processing stage. So they've been asked to pay administrative fees, and we hope that they've actually done that and attached these documents. Where INEC is the verification phase. And I agree with you that the fact that 14 have passed the first phase does not mean that those 14 will make it to the last stage, because the verification stage contains several activities. The first one is that these 14 parties will now have to demonstrate that their national executive has members from at least 24 states. Because one of the constitutional provision or qualifying criteria for party registration is you must have a national appeal. So that's one, that the national executive must contain members that come from at least 24 states. The second is that the constitution and the manifesto of the parties must comply with the 1999 Constitution, the 2022 Electoral Act, and the guidelines. The third is that the name, the logo, and the symbol of those political parties cannot and should not offend the Constitution as well as the Electoral Act. When you look at these two documents, they clearly stipulate that there are certain logos that are not permitted by law. Logos that have coat of arms, logos that have individuals, whether they are dead or they are alive, logos or symbols that project an ethnic or religious community, logos that relate to logos of security agencies. So those logos must not offend the act. Then also that the constitution of these 14 parties must conform with Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which relates to fundamental objectives and directive principles of state policy. They must also provide names and addresses of all their officers and also their proof of identity. In this case, their national ID, international passport, or permanent voter's card, but they would also provide their indigence certificate to establish that they have indigenship from those states, and then the fiscal attendance. So these are some of the stages. When they go through this verification stage and INEC is convinced that these 14 parties meet this, then they will now go to, the last stage where INEC would issue them their certificate. So the fact that you have this 14 does not mean that they will make it at the end of the day. They have to comply with provisions of the law.
Mr. Soto, what is of concern to me? Two things, but let me start with the first one. Ideological variance and differences. We've always maintained, I don't know whether it's in their books, but we don't see it in their character as political parties, even with the big ones, the APCs, the PDP, Labour, NMPP, and now ADC and the rest of them. There's no ideological variance, no ideological differences. Is that something INEC also looks at in approving political party? Because I'm seeing interesting names here. This particular one caught my attention, Green Future Party. What do you make of ideologies as part of a requirement to be able to drive the formation of political parties?
When you think about ideology are basically, the beliefs, the identity that political associations do have. And how is identity expressed? The identity or the ideology of a political party can be deduced from the foundational documents of the party, your party manifesto, your party constitution, the logo, even the name of a political party, the color of a political party projects, its ideology. But does INEC do content evaluation of those documents? Well, I would say yes and no. When you look at the fundamental objectives under Chapter 2, and that's why part of the verification process is to ensure that the manifestos of the political party conform with the Constitution. Now, depending on how the party frames its manifesto, what the Commission will be concerned about is, does it address the responsibilities of states? Because Chapter 2 contains what? What are those economic objectives? What are those cultural objectives? What are political objectives? What are the responsibilities of state to citizens? What are also citizens' responsibilities, to the state? It also talks about national values, and ethics. So you can deduce that from those documents. And that's why, for the most part, when you look at the manifestos of most political parties, except if a party, maintains a certain socialist or welfarist ideology, you will see that articulated in their social programs, in their cultural programs. And so you can deduce that from the documents. Are there some significant differences with those documents? Yes, you can see in terms of the party manifesto. But I think that one of the biggest takeaways from this is that political associations need to take party registration seriously. When you're going to be recognized as a political party, or you're applying to register as a political party, there are certain conditions that must be met. It is serious business. You cannot throw up certain names that assault the Constitution and even assault the whole concept of national unity and expect that the state is going to accept or our institutions will approve of that. So it's serious business, and political associations need to read the law, understand the rationale behind some of the criteria being set. And most of them is to ensure that you have viral, healthy institutions, political institutions, because if you're going to be contesting for power, then there are certain criteria that you must meet.
Mr. Itodo, allow me to squeeze in one final question before we let you go. We have an off-cycle election in Anambra State. I think we're barely 2 months away from that election. You are in Zambia, and I know that you travel a lot around the continent. This issue of voter turnout and voter apathy, it's a big concern. I wonder what you're seeing in the country where you are at this time, and how you think that perhaps INEC can turn things around in terms of voter confidence.
Last election in Zambia held in 2022, thereabout, and they recorded about 70% turnout. So Nigeria has a lot to learn when it comes to turnout for elections. In the last Anambra elections, only 10% of voters showed up, to cast their votes. I think it just borders on a few things. The first one is that we need to inspire trust and confidence on the part of citizens. If you look at the pre-election environment in Anambra, there are several issues that beg for concern. Issues relating to the power of incumbency, the lack of, a free space for political opposition and parties to contest. There's also, the use of state security outfits to oppress and intimidate people, and not allowing actors, to vie and contest. You see that abuse of incumbency happening in Anambra State in the build-up to the elections. And so there's a whole lot that needs to be done to ensure that voters actually come up. But if people don't trust that their votes will count, then they are not going to show up at elections. This is why INEC needs to maintain some level of consistency and also oversight in the build-up to the Anambra elections, because it will serve as a litmus test, but also that the National Assembly needs to accelerate the process of concluding the electoral reforms. Electronic transmission of results has to be integrated into the electoral process. And those reforms that have been highlighted, we hope that the National Assembly, when it resumes in 2 weeks' time, that it prioritizes this, concludes this process, and let's see if it's possible to have a new law before the Anambra election so that electronic transmission of results can be integrated into the results collation value chain.
Mr. Itodo, always a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much. Join us from Zambia. bring in your thoughts and expertise on the issue of election management. Samson Itodo is the Executive Director of Yiaga Africa. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.